associated with a list called countries. Then, immediately below that, I have a data list element whose ID is countries, where here I'm going to specify these are all of the options for what country we could have. Each one is inside of an option element whose value is whatever country they could select, and we have all of the countries of the world listed in these option elements. So this input here is going to allow me to select one option from a list of all of these possible options. So now if I open up form1.html, here's what that form ultimately looks like. I can here, inside of the name field, again that word name shows up because it's the placeholder. I can type in my name here, and inside of the password field, anything I type is going to show up as just little dots instead of the actual characters, because the type of that input field was password instead of the type being text. In favorite color, I now have the ability to choose between various different favorite color options in a radio button format. I choose from one of a number of options. And finally, inside this country dropdown, I have the ability now, when I click on it, to see all of the countries, but as I start to type letters like UNIT, it filters down to only the options that I actually care about. So here, if I type in enough letters, eventually I see United States, and I can click on that option as well. So HTML5 builds in these additional features to make it easy to implement something, like a text field where it will autocomplete based on the text that you provide. You can just specify that it is inside of this data list, and then provide a list of all the possible values, and then HTML and your web browser in turn will take care of the process of rendering that information in the way that you expect it to be displayed. So those are just some of the possible HTML elements that we can ultimately create by using these various different elements that we nest within each other. And there are definitely other HTML elements that exist as well that you can begin to explore, but all of them follow a very similar pattern. That we're going to have some tag that might require some attributes, additional information about the HTML, to give context to the web browser for how that element should be displayed. Maybe that element needs to have a particular source for an image, maybe it needs a link in order to link to somewhere, or other information as well. And then inside of that element, you might nest other elements, so that your table has rows, and inside of those rows we have other cells, and you might imagine nesting elements inside of other elements, inside of other elements. But right now, so far, all of our web pages have been rather simple. They've just been, we've described the structure of the page, and we've described we want a list here, we want a form there. What we might really like is some way of specifying that we want to style our web page in some way. We want to add color, we want to add spacing, we want to add some sort of other layout to our page as well. And in order to do that, we're going to use a second language that we're going to call CSS, short for Cascading Style Sheets. In particular, we'll use the latest version of CSS, CSS3, which gives us the ability to take an HTML page and tell the web browser how we would like it to be styled. Instead of just black text in the same font on a white background, we can begin to specify particular CSS properties of how we would like this page to look to make sure that the page looks the way we want it to. So let's take a look at a simple example now of CSS to take a look at how we can add some CSS code to our page. So I'll go ahead and create a new file that I'll call style.html, just to demonstrate some basic ideas of adding some style to our page. And we'll go ahead and copy the same hello.html from before. And maybe in addition to hello world, I display an H1, some big heading at the top that says like, welcome to my web page, for example. So now if I open up style.html, this is what I see. I see a big heading at the top that says, welcome to my web page, beneath which is just the text, hello world. And now imagine that I want to add some style to this heading at the top of the page. Maybe instead of being left aligned, I want it to be centered. Maybe instead of just being black text, I'd like to change the color. In order to do that, just as we've used attributes in the past to add additional information to this particular HTML page, we can do a very similar thing with CSS. We can specify that we're going to give this H1 element a style attribute, and that is going to be equal to, and then in quotation marks, we're going to provide all of the CSS properties that we would like to add to this particular element. So the way that CSS styling works is that we can give elements individual CSS properties, where a property is something like the color of the element or the alignment of the element. And each of those properties has a default value, but we can change its value to something else. So if, for example, I wanted to change the color of this heading, so that instead of a black heading, it displayed as a blue heading, I could say for this h1, I would like to give it a color property, and then to give the color property a value, I say color colon, and then the value that I would like to give to it. So color colon blue, for example, followed by a semicolon, will change the color of this h1 element to blue. And my text editor is automatically showing me a little square that shows me what this color blue is actually going to look like. This isn't part of the text, it's just my text editor being helpful so that I can see in advance as I'm writing this code what the color is actually going to look like. So now if I open up style.html, here's what I see. Instead of a black heading at the top, we've changed the color to blue. And there are many other built-in colors that exist within HTML that we can use in order to change the color to whatever we want. If instead of blue I said I want the color to be red, for instance, I can refresh the page, and now the heading is red, and there are many other colors. I can change the color to like spring green, for instance, and that's going to be a particular shade of green that displays just like this. And so now we have the ability to add various different style properties to individual elements. I can say, take this heading and change its style so that the color, instead of being black, is going to show up as blue instead. And if I want to add multiple CSS properties to the same HTML element, I can do that as well. Here in the style attribute, I can say that in addition to saying that the color is blue, I'd like to give a second CSS property to this element. I'd like to say that the text align property should be center, for example. The text align property controls, as you might imagine, how a particular HTML element has its text align. Is it all the way on the left, all the way on the right, or centered? And if I change the text align property to have a value of center, well then now when I refresh this page, I see that welcome to my web page is now both blue and it's centered. I've changed the color and I've changed the alignment of this particular element. And HTML elements don't need to just be styled directly. They can also get their style information from parent elements. So if you recall again that DOM structure, where we have an HTML element, inside of which is this body element, and inside of the body element is this h1 element and this text. You can imagine if we wanted this styling to apply not just to this heading, but also to the hello world text, I could move the styling information, move this style attribute, change it from the h1, and escalating it to this body. And if I move the style to the body, then everything inside of the body is going to be styled in that way. So let's now take a look at an example of that to see how that works. If I take this style information and I move it so that instead of associating it with the h1, I instead associate it with the body, then now, when I refresh the page, I see that both parts of the body, both the big heading at the top that says welcome to my web page, as well as the text hello world, both have those CSS properties applied. I've changed their color to blue, and I've also changed their text alignment to be centered instead of just left aligned. But if I do want it to just be that heading, then I can move it out and say that I just want to apply the style to that one individual heading. Now, one thing that we might imagine might become a problem over time is that imagine if I had multiple headings that I wanted to style in the same way, for example. Let's say I have a second heading that this is a second heading that I also want to be styled as blue and centered as well. I can refresh this page and see that right now that is not the case. And I don't want to make the entire page blue and centered. I only want these two headings to be blue and centered. So what I could do is I could just take this style code from the h1 and apply it to this h1 as well, so that both of my h1 elements now have the exact same style code. And I'll go ahead and refresh this, and now we see this is the intended behavior. I have two headings, both of which are centered, and both of which are blue. But what we want to start to think about as we start to build web applications, and especially as our web applications start to get a little bit more sophisticated, is to think about the design of how we're building our web pages and how we're building our web applications. And in particular, anytime we find ourselves copying a lot of the same information from one place to another, that's probably not the best design. And you should start to think about how might you design this a little bit better. It's not great design, one, just because there's some redundancy that probably doesn't need to be there, but also because it makes the page a little bit more difficult to change and a little more difficult to update. If I instead want to change both of these headings to be red instead of blue, then all of a sudden I need to change my code in two places. I need to change the style attribute on this first heading up here, And I also need to change the style attribute on this second heading down there. What I'd like to do is to somehow just be able to write the style code once and then have it applied to both of these headings. And in fact, there is a way to do that. What we can do is, instead of doing what we might call inline styling, where we take the CSS code and place it directly as an attribute of an HTML element, we can move our style code to an entirely different part of the web page. Recall again that at the top of our HTML page, we have this head section that just includes information that's useful to know about the web page, but isn't actually part of the body of the web page, the content that the user sees. This head section is a great place where we can begin to put some style information about how we would like for this web page to be styled. So what I can do here is, instead of putting these style attributes in line with these HTML elements, I can, inside of the head section of my web page, add a style element, where in between the opening style tag and the closing style tag, I can add any of the style information that I want. And here's the way that syntax is going to look. I first need to specify what types of elements am I going to style. And in this case, I want to style all of the H1s. So I can just say H1, and then all of the style code is going to go inside of a pair of curly braces, where I can say I would like the color to be blue, and I would like the text align property to be centered. So now, here's what I've done. I've taken the CSS code that used to be down here inside the body of the page, actually as an attribute of these H1 elements, and I've moved the style-related code to a different part of my page altogether. Now the style information is inside the header of my page, inside of the style element, where I've said, for every H1 element, here's how you should style it. The styling is in between the opening and curly closing braces here. And I've said that every H1 should have a color of blue, and every H1 should have a text align property of center. And that is then going to apply to all of the H1 elements that my web page happens to find inside the body of my web page. So there's a couple of advantages here. Advantage number one is what we talked about a moment ago. I don't need to duplicate the same code in both of these H1 elements. I can write it once and say apply this styling to all of the H1s that show up in the page. And advantage number two is we've been able to factor out the style code to somewhere else just to make it a little bit cleaner. So that instead of having a really long line, you might imagine if we had not just 2, but maybe 5 or 6 or 7 different CSS properties that would have taken up a lot of space on one line, I can instead, in a more readable, more organized way, move that style-related code to the style element at the beginning of the page, just to make it easier to read, easier to visually understand, and just to clean up the body of the web page as well. And that's going to be another of the key themes that's going to come up again and again in this class, this idea of separating things out so that every piece can sort of be independent of one another. Our structure of the web page inside the body is separate from the style. And we'll see the same sort of idea appear again and again as we begin to try to design web applications well. So now if I take this exact same page and go ahead and refresh style.html, we'll see that we see the exact same thing. Both of the headings still show up as centered, both of them still show up as blue, but now we have the advantage of having only written the style code once instead of needing to write the exact same style code multiple times in the same way. But it turns out that we can even do a little bit better than this. Because one thing you might imagine is that if I have a web application or a website that has multiple different web pages, it's probably going to be likely that each of those web pages might need to be styled in similar ways. If I have a big banner at the top of one web page, then in other pages related to that page, I might want the same banner, styled in the same way, using similar style information. And right now, our CSS code is specific to one particular page. And it's not going to be easy to then take that same styling and apply it to another page. If I wanted to, I'd need to copy the exact same CSS code, put it inside of another page, but then we run into the same problem of duplication, where I've now had to repeat myself across multiple different pages, putting the exact same CSS code across all those different pages. So there is an improvement we can make, and the improvement we can make is to take that CSS code and just move it to an entirely different file. So instead of putting this style code inside of a style element inside of this HTML page, I'll just create a new file that I'll call styles.css, inside of which is going to be all of the CSS that I care about. I want to take every H1, I want to change its color to blue, and now I want to change its text-align property to center. And now, inside of my HTML page, I no longer need to include any CSS at all. Instead of this style element altogether, I can just link my CSS code in that CSS file called styles.css to this particular HTML page. And how do I link the styles.css file? Well, I can do so, again, in the head section of my web page using a link tag, where I can say I'd like this link to be, the relationship is it's going to be a style sheet, meaning what I'm about to link is going to be a style sheet for this page. It's going to describe how I want for the elements on this page to be styled. And then, just as in the case of a link to another page, I use href to specify a hyperlink reference, what I want to link to. I'm now going to specify, using an href attribute, what CSS file I would like to now link. And in this case, the CSS file that I'm going to link is styles.css. That is the file that just so happens to contain all of the CSS that I would like to apply to this particular file. Now, if I refresh the page, I see again, nothing has changed. In the last 2 revisions, the page has stayed exactly the same as far as the user is concerned. They still see 2 headings, both of them are centered, both of them are blue, but now the advantage is that here is my HTML. It's shorter than it was before, and in particular, there's no CSS that's baked in to this HTML file at all. I factored it all out into this separate styles.css file. And now if I have multiple HTML files that are all using the same styling, I can just link them all to the same styles.css file, such that they're all using the same style information. I don't need to repeat myself, and if ever I need to make a change across all of those pages, I just change the styling once. I change the styles.css file, and then all of the web pages that are linked to that style sheet will update as well in order to reflect those changes. So again, we've been able to factor out some of this style information to a separate file just to make our lives a little bit easier. All right, so far we've now seen how we can use CSS in a number of different ways to add some basic styles to our page. We've seen that we can take an element and change its color. We've seen how we can take an element and change its alignment, move it from left aligned to right aligned to centered, for example. As it turns out, there are a lot of different CSS properties that we can add to our HTML elements in order to style them in various different ways.